The great chamber stood silent as Lyria Moonshadow watched the empty seat where the human delegation used to sit, and her silver hair moved slightly as she turned her head to see the other council members, and they all looked confused and worried about something that had just happened only moments ago. And beside her massive form, the dragon called Emberwing lay coiled in the shadows, with copper scales that seemed to glow in the dim light of the chamber. The speaker of the council, whose name was Vexthar, raised one of his 6 hands, and his multiple eyes blinked one after another as he spoke to the assembled representatives from across the galaxy, and his voice carried worry even though he tried to hide it from everyone present in the room. The human delegation had left, and their final message was very short, and it contained only a few words. That made no sense to most of the council members who had expected the humans to argue or complain or demand another vote on the matter. They had discussed just 3 days earlier. Lyria felt something wrong in the air, and she had lived for more than 1,000 years, and in all that time she had never seen any species just leave, without making some kind of scene or protest or dramatic speech about how they were being treated unfairly by the others. The humans were young compared to most species in the council, and they had only been traveling between stars for about 300 years, which was nothing compared to the elves who had been doing it for thousands of years, and the humans had always been loud and energetic and full of ideas that sometimes worked and sometimes did not. But now they were quiet, and that silence felt more dangerous than any of their previous loud arguments or passionate speeches about honor and duty and protecting the innocent from threats that others chose to ignore. Vexthar spoke again and told everyone what the humans had said in their final transmission, and the words were simple and cold and completely unlike how the humans usually talked when they were upset about council decisions. "We are going home, and good luck with everything." That was all they said, and then they closed their communication channels, and their ships began moving away from the council station and headed back toward their own territory in a pattern that looked organized and planned, rather than chaotic and emotional. Emberwing lifted his great head, and his golden eyes looked at Lyria, and she felt his thoughts touch her mind, the way they always did when they shared concerns about something. And the dragon was worried because he sensed that the humans knew something important that the council had missed. Lyria walked to her personal terminal and pulled up the star maps that showed where all the different species had their territories and colonies and stations, and she focused on the section that belonged to humanity, and what she saw made her feel cold inside, despite the warmth that Emberwing always radiated. Every single human colony was moving, and every station was being evacuated, and every ship was traveling back toward Earth and the human home system, and they were not running in panic, but moving with military precision like soldiers following orders that had been planned long before this moment. She looked at the movement patterns and realized that the humans had been preparing for this, and they had known that the council would reject their warnings and their pleas for help against the threat that was coming from beyond the galactic rim. 3 days ago, the council had voted on whether to help humanity fight against something called the Void Swarm, and Lyria remembered how the human representative named Kate Morgan had stood before them with data and projections and warnings about what would happen if they did nothing. Kate Morgan had been calm and professional, and she brought military advisors and scientists who explained in detail how the Void Swarm worked and how it consumed everything in its path, and how waiting would only make things worse for everyone in the galaxy. The Void Swarm had already destroyed 17 star systems, and billions of beings had died, and the humans said that this was only the beginning, and that the swarm would keep coming and keep eating and keep destroying until someone stopped it. But the council voted no, and they said that the threat was exaggerated and that humanity was too young to understand galactic politics, and that they should wait and observe before taking military action, and many council members suggested that the humans were just being paranoid because they were an aggressive species. Lyria had said nothing during the vote, and she had watched as Kate Morgan nodded slowly and gathered her papers and simply walked out of the chamber without arguing or shouting or making any of the dramatic gestures that other species usually made when they lost an important vote. That should have been a warning sign, but nobody paid attention because they were too busy congratulating themselves on avoiding an unnecessary war. Now Lyria understood what she should have seen 3 days ago. And the humans had not been asking for help because they thought the council would say yes, and they had been asking one final time to see if anyone would listen before they cut all ties and went home to prepare for what was coming. She pulled up the communication logs and tried to contact any human station or ship or outpost, but everything was silent, and the only response she got was from an automated message buoy at the edge of human territory. The message played, and it was Kate Morgan speaking, and she looked tired, but her voice was firm and clear. Humanity is no longer accepting diplomatic channels, and do not follow us, and you made your choice. The message ended, and Lyria felt Emberwing move behind her, and the dragon stretched his wings and spoke in a way that everyone in the chamber could hear through the mental link that all dragons could create when they wanted others to understand them. The young sometimes see clearly what the old refuse to acknowledge, and we have made a terrible mistake. Vexthar was shh. The first wave of the Void Swarm hit the Peltharian colonies exactly 18 hours after humanity closed its borders, and Lyria stood in the war room watching holographic displays that showed what was happening in real time across multiple star systems, and Emberwing radiated heat behind her as they both witnessed worlds dying before their eyes. The Peltharians were known throughout the galaxy as one of the fiercest warrior races, and they had conquered more than 100 worlds through strength and tactical brilliance, and their military was supposed to be nearly unstoppable according to every strategic assessment that the Council had ever produced. They lasted 4 hours against the Void. Swarm Lyria watched as Peltharian battle fleets engaged the enemy with every weapon they possessed, and the warriors fought with courage and honor and determination. But none of it mattered because the Void Swarm simply consumed everything it touched and grew stronger with each ship it destroyed. The swarm moved through space like a living thing, and it was made of creatures that seemed to phase in and out of normal reality, and wherever they went, they left nothing behind except empty void, where matter used to exist. Vexthar was no longer calm, and his composure had completely shattered as he watched member species dying, and he shouted orders to deploy defense fleets and prepare evacuation routes, and someone needed to contact the humans immediately and offer them anything they wanted. Lyria had already tried contacting humanity, and every communication channel was dark and silent, and the only response she received was that automated message from Kate Morgan telling them not to follow, and reminding them that they had made their choice. She had attempted to reach human colonies and military stations and even civilian outposts, but everything was locked down tight, and humanity had completely sealed itself away from the rest of the galaxy. One council member suggested sending a fleet to human territory to demand their assistance, but Lyria quickly accessed the sensor data and showed everyone what humanity had done to their borders. The entire outer perimeter of human space was now a dead zone filled with automated defense platforms and weapons satellites and mines that would destroy anything that tried to enter without permission, and the humans had built this defensive network in secret, while the Council had been busy debating and dismissing their warnings. Another world fell on the displays, and Lyria counted how many beings had died in just the last hour, and the number was already in the millions and climbing rapidly. She pulled up the records from 3 days ago and reviewed everything that Kate Morgan had presented to the Council, and the human representative had brought 17 different strategic analyses that explained exactly how the Void Swarm operated and what tactics would be needed to fight it effectively. Colonel Amy Hayes had been there too, and she was the human military advisor who had spent 2 hours explaining the nature of the threat and how the swarm created tiers in reality that allowed it to move faster than conventional fleets could respond. The council had called them warmongers and said that humanity was too young to understand the complexities of galactic threats, and several members had laughed when Colonel Hayes suggested that traditional weapons would be ineffective against an enemy that existed partially outside normal space. Now those same council members were watching their worlds burn and their fleets dissolve into nothing as the Void Swarm proved that the humans had been right about everything. Emberwing stretched his wings, and the dragon's voice resonated through the chamber, using the psychic link that let everyone hear his thoughts. The young sometimes see clearly what the old refuse to acknowledge, and we have paid for our pride with innocent blood. Lyria looked at the tactical displays and saw that the council was trying to form defensive lines using conventional fleet formations and traditional weapons, and none of it was working because they were fighting an enemy that did not follow the normal rules of warfare. She remembered what Kate Morgan had shown them, and the humans had developed something called quantum disruption weapons that could collapse the reality tiers that the Void Swarm used to move and feed and grow stronger. The technology was experimental, but the human simulations had shown it could work, if deployed correctly, with precise timing and coordinated firing patterns across multiple ships. The Council had rejected the technology as unproven human desperation, and several members had suggested that sharing such weapons would be dangerous because humanity might use them against other Council species in the future. Now that refusal to trust was costing lives by the millions, and the Council had no effective defense against an enemy that the humans had understood and prepared to fight. Vexthar demanded answers and wanted to know why their superior technology and ancient wisdom was failing against this threat, and nobody had a good response because the truth was too painful to admit. They had been arrogant, and they had believed that thousands of years of experience made them superior to a species that had barely been in space for 3 centuries, and they had dismissed human warnings because accepting them would mean admitting that the young race had seen something that the ancient ones had missed. Lyria pulled up more data and showed the Council what humanity had been doing during the months before the vote. And the humans had not just been preparing speeches and presenting evidence to the Council, and they had also been quietly evacuating non-essential personnel and stockpiling resources and building defensive networks. Kate Morgan and her team had known that the Council would say no, and they had prepared for that outcome. And when the vote came, they simply executed plans that had been ready for weeks. The humans had tried one last time to save the Council from itself, and when that failed, they went home to save themselves. Another fleet died on the displays, and this one belonged to the crystalline Zathori, who had evolved beyond physical weakness according to their own claims, and the Void Swarm consumed them just as easily as it had consumed the mighty Peltharians. Vexthar turned to Lyria and asked her what humanity would want in exchange for helping them now, and she knew the answer even though it hurt to say it out loud. Nothing that we can offer will bring them back because we had our chance and we rejected it, and now they are focused on survival, and they will not risk their people to save those who refuse to listen. The dragon rumbled his agreement and added that humanity had learned a hard lesson about the price of trying to help others who did not want to be helped. The war room fell silent, except for the sounds of dying worlds and collapsing civilizations. And Lyria made a decision that would change her life forever. She would go to human space, and she would beg them to reconsider, and she would admit that the Council had been wrong and that she herself had been complicit in this disaster by remaining silent during the vote. Emberwing touched her mind and asked if she was certain, because the humans had told everyone not to follow, and they might destroy anyone who tried to cross their borders. Lyria looked at the displays one more time and saw the death toll climbing into the billions, and she knew that D3 weeks had passed since humanity sealed its borders, and the Void Swarm had consumed half of the Council territories, and now it reached the inner systems where the most important worlds were located, and millions of refugees fled in ships that had nowhere safe to go. The Council defense fleets gathered at a place called Nexus Prime, which was a strategic junction point that connected multiple major trade routes, and military experts said this position should hold for months if they could establish proper defensive lines. Lyria fought in the battle that followed, and Emberwing carried her through chaos as the dragon breathed fire that turned swarm creatures into ash, and they destroyed dozens of enemy ships, but it made no difference to the overall outcome. For every enemy they killed, 10 more appeared from the reality tiers, and the swarm just kept coming in endless waves that never stopped and never slowed down, and the Council fleets were being ground down through sheer attrition. Nexus Prime fell in 6 days. Lyria had seen the human battle plans that Kate Morgan presented, and those plans identified the weakness in how the Void Swarm operated and explained that the reality tears could be collapsed using quantum disruption weapons fired in precise coordinated patterns. Humanity had offered to share that technology freely with any Council member who wanted it. And they had even volunteered to train other species in how to manufacture and deploy the weapons effectively. The Council Military Committee had rejected the offer and called it unproven human desperation, and they said that conventional weapons from species with thousands of years of warfare experience would be more than adequate. Now Lyria flew through a graveyard of those conventional weapons and watched proud warships explode because their crews had been too arrogant to accept help from a younger species. Emberwing banked hard to avoid a tendril of void matter that reached out from a reality tear, and the tendril touched a heavy cruiser that was flying beside them, and the ship simply ceased to exist as if it had never been built. Her communicator crackled, and a voice came through, identifying itself as Council member Tavara, who was a fellow elf from the Military Directorate. And she told Lyria to fall back to Sanctuary Station because they were evacuating the Council itself. The dragon asked where they would run, because the swarm was everywhere now, and it consumed everything, and there was nowhere in Council space that would be safe for very long. Lyria made her decision in that moment and told Emberwing to plot a course for human space, and the dragon questioned whether that was wise, because the humans had clearly said not to follow them. She knew the humans had told everyone to stay away, but she was not going as a Council ambassador or a military representative, and she was going as someone who had been too blind to see the truth when it mattered most. Maybe the humans would shoot them down at the border, and maybe it was already too late to make any difference. But she had to try, because sitting back and watching everything die while doing nothing was not acceptable anymore. Emberwing felt her determination through their bond, and agreed to take her, because this was why he had chosen her as his partner centuries ago, and they broke away from the retreating formation and turned toward the sealed borders of human territory. Behind them, the Council fleets scattered in every direction, and the great galactic council that had stood for 10,000 years collapsed into chaos as species tried to save themselves and stopped coordinating with each other. Lyria had served the council faithfully for 800 years, and she had fought in dozens of wars and helped negotiate hundreds of treaties, but she had never seen anything like this total breakdown of order and cooperation. The other species were abandoning the Council station and heading for their homeworlds or their colonies or anywhere that seemed safer than staying together, and the unity that had lasted for millennia was dissolving in just weeks. She thought about Kate Morgan and how the human representative had stood before the Council and calmly explained what would happen if they did nothing, and Kate had not been angry or emotional, and she had simply presented facts and projections. The Council had treated her like a child who did not understand galactic politics, and now that child's people were the only ones who had prepared properly for what was coming. Emberwing flew faster, and they left the battle zone behind and headed for the dead zone that separated Council space from human territory, and Lyria knew that crossing that boundary might be the last thing she ever did. She accessed her data files and reviewed everything about human culture and military doctrine that she had studied over the years. And one thing stood out clearly in her mind. Humans valued actions, Over words and apologies without changed behavior meant nothing to them, so she could not just say sorry and expect them to forgive the council, and she would have to prove, through her choices, that she had learned from the mistake and was willing to stand with them regardless of what her own people thought. The dragon agreed with her assessment and added that humanity had shown remarkable patience with the council's arrogance, and the fact that they had tried so many times to warn everyone showed that they genuinely wanted to help. But there was a limit to patience, and the council had found that limit when they rejected the final warning and dismissed human concerns as warmongering from an aggressive young species. Now humanity was focused on survival, and they had withdrawn behind defenses that would destroy anyone who tried to force their best way in, and Lyria did not blame them for that choice. She would have done the same thing if her people had been treated the way humans were treated by the council. The sensor displays showed that they were approaching the outer edge of the dead zone, and Emberwing slowed down, because entering human space without permission would be suicide. Lyria thought about all the beings who had died in the past 3 weeks, and how many of those deaths could have been prevented if the council had just listened to Kate Morgan and her advisors. She thought about the Peltharian warriors who fought with honor and died because their leaders rejected human technology. She thought about the crystalline Zathori, who believed they had evolved beyond physical weakness and discovered that the Void Swarm did not care about evolutionary advantages. She thought about millions of refugees fleeing in ships with no safe destination because the Council had been too proud to accept help from humanity. The dead zone that marked the outer boundary of human space stretched for 30 light years in every direction, and it was filled with automated defense platforms and weapon satellites and mines that humanity had placed during the final weeks before they sealed their borders. Emberwing absorbed the impact of the first warning shot, and his scales protected him from a plasma burst that would have vaporized most ships, and Lyria felt the heat wash over them. But the dragon was built to withstand much worse. She activated her communicator and broadcast on all frequencies that humans might be monitoring, and identified herself as Lyria Moonshadow of the Elven Enclaves, and she made it clear that she was not coming as a representative of the council. She told them that she came as someone who had made a terrible mistake, and she would not try to penetrate their borders without permission. And all she asked was a chance to speak with someone who could hear what she needed to say. Silence answered her transmission, and then another plasma burst fired from a hidden platform, and this shot deliberately missed them by several hundred meters. Emberwing observed that the humans were testing them to see if they would turn back or return fire or try to force their way through the defenses. Lyria told the dragon to hold position and not move toward human space and not fire any weapons, and they would simply wait here until the humans decided what to do with them. They floated in empty space for 3 hours, and Lyria watched the sensor displays showing ghost signatures of dozens of defense platforms tracking their every movement, and the humans had fortified this approach with the same careful precision that Kate Morgan had tried to bring to the council defense plans. She thought about how the council had mocked human paranoia and excessive military preparation, and now that paranoia was the only thing keeping humanity alive while everyone else died. Finally, a response came through her communicator, but it was not Kate Morgan speaking, and instead she heard a younger woman who sounded tired but sharp and alert. The woman identified herself as Commander Lisa Bennett of the Earth Defense Perimeter, and she said that they had been watching the council collapse, and it was happening exactly as human projections had predicted. Commander Bennett asked why Lyria was here at the border and what she wanted from humanity after the council had rejected every warning and dismissed every offer of help. Lyria answered with complete honesty and said that she came to beg and to offer what she should have offered 3 weeks ago, which was simple belief in what the humans had been trying to tell them. She explained that Kate Morgan had been right about everything, and the council had been wrong, and now billions of beings were dying because of arrogance and pride and refusal to listen to uncomfortable truths. A long silence followed, and Emberwing touched her mind with support and encouragement. Commander Bennett spoke again and said that Director Morgan was busy coordinating humanity's survival and did not have time for council politics or diplomatic games. Lyria responded that she was not here for politics, and she was not here to play games, and she was here because she had watched the Peltharian homeworld burn and seen 50 species make their last stands, and everything that Kate Morgan warned about was happening exactly as predicted. She told Commander Bennett that she had been in the council chamber when Kate presented the path to survival, and Lyria had said nothing when the vote came, and that silence made her complicit in genocide. Another pause followed, and this one lasted even longer than before. Commander Bennett finally spoke and told them to hold position because someone was coming out to meet them. But if this was some kind of desperate council trick or deception, then her orders were to turn both Lyria and her dragon into scattered particles. Lyria understood and accepted those terms. Emberwing noted that humanity had learned the price of mercy, and they would not make the same mistake that the council made by trusting those who had already proven themselves untrustworthy. The dragon was right, and humans had shown patience and tried repeatedly to help, and offered their technology freely, and the council had thrown it all back in their faces. Now humanity would be cautious and suspicious, and Lyria did not blame them because she would have felt the same way if their positions were reversed. A human vessel emerged from the defensive perimeter, and it was small and fast and covered with weapons that tracked both her and Emberwing as it approached. The ship bore a symbol that Lyria recognized from her cultural studies, and it was the insignia of Kate Morgan's personal diplomatic corps. When the airlock opened, Kate herself stood there, and she looked like she had aged 10 years in 3 weeks, and stress had carved lines around her eyes that had not been there during the council presentation. Behind Kate stood Colonel Amy Hayes, with her hand resting on a sidearm, and both women watched Lyria with expressions that showed no trust and no welcome. Kate spoke first, and her voice was flat and tired, and she said that she was only here because Commander Bennett reported that Lyria had called herself complicit in genocide, and that took either courage or stupidity. Lyria bowed her head in respect and thanked Kate for agreeing to see her Emberwing barely fit in the human ship's small hangar. But the dragon folded himself carefully and radiated warmth that was meant to be non-threatening and calming. The dragon spoke aloud so both humans could hear him and said that they came seeking neither forgiveness nor shelter but only knowledge. Kate raised one eyebrow and asked what kind of knowledge they wanted. Lyria explained that she wanted to know how humanity intended to survive what was coming, because the Void Swarm would not stop at Council worlds, and eventually it would reach human space. She told Kate that when she saw how humanity had prepared and planned for the worst outcome, she realized that humans already knew the swarm would eventually come here. Kate and Amy exchanged glances, and some unspoken communication passed between them. Finally, Kate sighed and told them to follow her. She led them through corridors filled with humans working at an intense pace, and they passed checkpoints where soldiers watched Emberwing with weapons ready, but did not fire. The activity level was incredible, and everyone seemed to know exactly what they were doing, and there was no panic or chaos, just focused, determined effort. They reached a command center where holographic displays showed not just human space, but detailed behavioral models of how the Void Swarm moved and fed and grew. Kate pulled up a star chart and confirmed what Lyria had suspected and said that humanity knew the swarm would eventually reach them because it consumed everything and would not stop until it ran out of matter to feed on. She explained that humanity could not stop the swarm because no one species had that kind of power, but they could survive it if they were smart and prepared and willing to do what was necessary. Lyria asked Kate to show her what humanity had planned. What Kate revealed made Lyria feel awe and terror in equal measure because humanity had not just withdrawn to hide behind walls and wait to die. They had transformed their entire home system into a fortress that used technologies the Council had never imagined, and the quantum disruption weapons were only the beginning of what humans had developed. Kate explained that humanity would hold their position for years or decades if necessary, and when the swarm finally passed, because it would eventually consume everything available and move on looking for new feeding grounds, then humanity would emerge and rebuild. Not the old council system, but something better and stronger. Lyria made her choice and asked Kate to let her fight alongside humanity, and she would prove that some beings could learn from their mistakes. Kate studied her face for a long time, searching for deception or hidden motives. She finally asked if Lyria understood what she was requesting, because the council would call her a traitor, and her own people might exile her forever. Lyria answered that her people were already dead or dying because they would not listen, and she would rather be a living traitor than an honored corpse, buried in the ruins of pride. Amy Hayes spoke up and said that they could use a dragon in the defense network and someone who knew Council fleet tactics for when survivors inevitably tried to force their way into human space. Kate remained quiet and continued studying Lyria's face and Emberwing's posture, looking for any sign of dishonesty. Finally, she nodded and welcomed them to humanity's last stand, but warned them not to make humans regret this decision. Emberwing promised that they would not, and this time they would listen and learn. 53 years passed since the day Lyria and Emberwing crossed into human space, and now she stood on the observation deck of a station called Humanity's Hope, watching the last traces of the void swarm collapse into quantum foam as it finally consumed itself and disappeared from reality. The dragon beside her had scales that showed gray with age, but his golden eyes remained as sharp as they had been when they first met 1,000 years ago, and together they had fought through 5 decades of desperate defense. The galaxy beyond the windows was silent and empty, because 90% of the council species were either extinct or scattered across isolated pockets with no way to communicate or coordinate with each other. But behind them, human space thrived and expanded and prepared to venture back out into the ruins to search for survivors and begin the long process of rebuilding civilization. Kate Morgan joined them at the viewport, and she was elderly now and used a cane to walk, but her mind remained sharp, and her voice still carried authority when she spoke. She told Lyria that humanity was ready to go back out into the galaxy and find whoever had survived and help them rebuild, and they could use someone who understood both human thinking and council culture. A dragon and an elf who had learned how to listen would be valuable assets in the reconstruction effort. Lyria smiled, and the expression felt strange after so many years of war and hardship, but it was genuine because she had found purpose in those decades fighting alongside humanity. She told Kate that someone needed to explain to the survivors what humanity had learned. While everyone else had been too proud to pay attention, Kate asked what lesson that would be. Lyria looked out at the stars and thought about everything that had happened since that day in the council chamber, when the humans departed quietly and left the rest of them to face the consequences of their arrogance. She said that survival does not belong to the strongest species or the oldest civilizations or even the wisest councils, and instead it belongs to those who can admit when they are wrong and change their behavior accordingly. Emberwing's laughter rumbled through the station, and the dragon said that the young teaching the old was exactly how things should be. During the 53 years, Lyria had learned many things about humanity that the Council had never understood because they were too busy looking down on humans as inexperienced children. She learned that humans valued honesty over politeness and would rather hear uncomfortable truth than comfortable lies. She learned that human military doctrine emphasized adaptability over tradition, and they changed tactics constantly based on what actually worked rather than what should work according to ancient theory. She learned that humans built redundant systems for everything important because they assumed that things would fail and prepared backup plans for their backup plans. She learned that human commanders trusted their junior officers to make decisions in the field rather than requiring approval for every action from distant leadership. Most importantly, she learned that humans remembered who stood with them and who abandoned them, and they rewarded loyalty while never forgetting betrayal. In the early years after she joined them, many humans had been suspicious of her and questioned whether an elf who served the council for centuries could really change. She proved herself through action rather than words and fought beside them in hundreds of engagements and never asked for special treatment because of her age or experience. Emberwing had become a crucial part of the defense network, and his ability to survive in hard vacuum and generate intense heat made him perfect for destroying swarm bioships before they could reach human installations. The dragon had also served as a living link between different human defensive positions because his psychic abilities allowed him to relay information faster than electronic communications. When the swarm was disrupting normal channels, Kate Morgan had become a close friend during those decades, and Lyria often advised her on how council species thought and helped predict what desperate refugees might do when they reached human borders. Many survivors had tried to force their way into human space during the worst years, and Lyria helped negotiate with them and explained that humanity would share resources and technology, but only with those who asked respectfully and acknowledged past mistakes. Some refugee groups accepted those terms and integrated into human society and brought their own knowledge and skills to help strengthen the defense. Others refused and tried to take what they wanted by force and died against the same defensive network that had kept the Void Swarm at bay. Lyria had watched her own people arrive at human borders in broken ships with nowhere else to go, and she had spoken with elven leaders who still believed they deserved special treatment because of their ancient heritage. She told them plainly that the time for pride was over and humanity was offering survival, but not on council terms, and they could accept that reality or die floating in space. Most of them accepted, and she helped them settle on human worlds where they worked alongside the species they had once looked down upon. A few refused and tried to establish independent elven colonies outside human protection, and the Void Swarm consumed them within weeks. Over the decades, Lyria had earned respect from humans not because of her age or her species, but because she kept her word and fought beside them and never claimed credit. She had not earned young human soldiers who had grown up hearing stories about the council's collapse, would sometimes ask her why the council failed, and she always gave them the same answer. Pride blinds and humility saves, and the council forgot that wisdom can come from unexpected sources. Kate asked if she was ready to go back out into the ruins and help rebuild. Lyria said yes, because this was the work that mattered, and perhaps by helping survivors learn from the council's mistakes they could build something better. Emberwing agreed and added that he was curious to see what kind of civilization would emerge from the ashes. They stood together watching the stars, and Lyria thought about Kate Morgan standing in the council chamber presenting warnings that no one wanted to hear. She thought about how humanity had departed quietly without drama or threats, and simply went home to prepare for the storm they knew was coming. She thought about 53 years of fighting and surviving and learning to see the universe through human eyes. And she thought about the future that humanity was building, where survival did not depend on ancient pride, but on willingness to adapt and change and listen to uncomfortable truths. Kate put her hand on Lyria's shoulder and said they would leave in a week. 7 days to prepare for the long journey into ruins where broken civilizations waited for someone to show them a better path forward. Lyria looked at Emberwing, and the dragon met her gaze with ancient eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall. Together, they had chosen humanity when the council fell apart, and now together they would help build what came next. The stars waited, and somewhere in that darkness survivors struggled alone. But they would not be alone much longer, because humanity was coming, and they brought with them an elf and a dragon who had learned the price of pride and the value of humility. The observation deck fell quiet, and Lyria closed her eyes and prepared herself for whatever challenges waited beyond human borders. 53 years ago, she had flown to this space seeking knowledge. Now she was flying back out to share what she had learned. The void swarm was gone, but its lessons remained, and those lessons would shape everything that came after. And she thought about her own silence during the vote 3 days before the humans left, and how she had watched Kate Morgan gather her papers and walk away, and done nothing to stop the disaster that she knew was coming. Emberwing felt her guilt and regret through their bond, and the dragon reminded her that guilt was useless unless it led to changed behavior. She agreed and told him that was exactly why they were flying toward human space, even though it might mean their deaths. The dragon chuckled and said that after 1,000 years together, he would not want to die any other way than by her side, trying to do the right thing. They reached the edge of human territory and stopped and waited to see what would happen next, and Lyria prepared herself for whatever response came from the species that the council had abandoned. Nothing was no longer an option, even if trying meant her own death. She told Emberwing to prepare for flight, and the dragon agreed because he understood that some things were worth dying for, and admitting mistakes was one of them. They left the war room while the council continued arguing about strategies that would not work and weapons that could not harm the enemy, and Lyria wondered if anyone else would have the courage to face what they had done, outing orders now and demanding that someone contact the human government and offer them whatever they wanted if they would just come back and help defend the council against the void swarm. But Lyria knew it was too late. She had studied human history and culture during her time as an ambassador, and she knew that humans had a saying about bridges being burned, and there was no going back once certain decisions were made. The council had treated humanity like ignorant children who did not understand the complexities of galactic civilization, and they had dismissed human warnings as the overreactions of a warrior species that was too eager to fight. But the humans had been right, and they had seen the danger clearly, while the council members who had lived for thousands of years had been blind to it. Lyria looked at the star maps again and saw that the void swarm was still advancing, and it had consumed 3 more systems in just the past week, and soon it would reach the territories of the council members who had voted against helping humanity. She wondered how long they would last, and whether the council would finally admit that they had been wrong, and whether that admission would come before or after millions more beings died because of pride and arrogance. Emberwing spoke again, and his voice was sad. They warned us with words, and we did not listen, and now they warn us with silence, and perhaps that will be the lesson that finally teaches us wisdom. The council chamber filled with noise as representatives began arguing and blaming each other and demanding action. But Lyria just stood there watching the maps and knowing that everything was about to change in ways that none of them were ready to face.